Raising children in today's environment has numerous challenges, such as cultural influences, amongst others. Former Bafana Bafana star Matthew Booth, who's in an interracial marriage, has had to contend with raising mixed-race children in our Rainbow Nation. This is how we cope. I'm Hugo Ribatika. Race issues are very topical at the moment, and in studio we have Matthew Booth, expert on the issue, in fact. Matthew Booth, former Bafana Bafana, played for South Africa many years ago. Matthew, thank you so much for coming onto the show and speaking to us.
It's a pleasure, Hugo.
Let's talk about where the love of football began for you.
Yeah, so I grew up in Fish Hoek in Cape Town, in the south, on the peninsula, and my dad had three brothers, and all four of them played football. They played rugby and cricket and whatever at school, but their true love, I think, was football. And I did something very similar. I played any ball sport that was available. I think in South Africa we're very fortunate that, you know, quite a few of our schools and the weather allows us to play a number of different sports, which creates holistic athletes. But football, again, was sort of my true passion. So I think the influence from my dad and his brothers, and then also just a natural inclination for the game.
But obviously, particularly before 1994, football was predominantly a black sport.
Well, it still is, and if you understand the demographics of South Africa, then you'll know, you know, it's the most popular sport in the world. It's the most popular sport here in South Africa. So naturally, the demographics will be that way. But it's slightly skewed when you look at the professional game, as opposed to amateur football. If you go down to most well-established amateur clubs and you look at their junior sections, it's a rainbow of color. And we tend to lose not only white kids, but also kids across the board, you know, black, colored, Indian kids, particularly at the age of 14, 15, 16.
What happens then?
I feel that there are certain distractions for middle class and upper class kids. Now that's the most important distinction here. It's more of a class issue nowadays, where kids from lower LSMs are more hungry and they have less distractions. One of my teammates, for example, my ex-teammates, would always tell me, Matthew, where I grew up, which was in Hanover Park in Cape Town, I only had two options, gangsterism or football. And luckily he chose the latter.
So it really is about survival in many respects.
You know, when you look at Brazil, the number of footballers that they create or produce, a lot of them come from, in fact, most of them come from the favelas, sort of our townships. And they're hungry. They're hungry for success. And one of the few avenues out of that situation is football. Similarly here in South Africa, you know, so it's not, I like to think it's not necessarily a race issue. It's more of a class issue. And I think most professional sporting codes will agree with me, you know. But obviously football, you know, reflects, because of its popularity, it reflects society, and often vice versa. Yeah.
So 2009, you made your debut for Bafana Bafana, obviously 5 years after the birth of the Rainbow Nation. What were the challenges being this white man playing with a team of predominantly black guys?
Yeah, so when I first started playing professional football, the teams that I played in were, including Bafana Bafana, were representative of our demographic. In fact, if you look back at 1996, you know, if you wanted to split it along racial lines, there were probably too many white guys and colored guys in the team, you know, if that's the way you wanted to look at it. And sort of over the course of time, we've had changes in that demographic, which is natural. I mean, you can't dictate to a coach or a team how many players of color you should have and so forth, you know. Just doesn't work that way. And it just so happened that in 2009 and 2010, where I received a lot of publicity, that I happened to be the only one white guy in the team. So it made me a little bit uncomfortable about the attention that came my way. And I had to explain to everybody that, look, normally this is not the case, you know. And you know, in our football industry, we've never had an issue with race.
So what were the sort of questions that were asked?
Well, you know, for the local reporters and local fans, they knew the story. It was the sudden surge or increase in foreign journalists that arrived on our shores, and they were caught up in the optics, the visuals of the situation, and they were fascinated by me. So it was a bit tiresome having to explain kind of our history and why this is so. I had to also explain to them that the crowd was not booing me. Yeah. I had to explain to them about John Shoes Moshweo, Mark Fish, that it was traditional for fans to shout and scream the surnames of players, certain players. So it was an interesting time. It was a little bit embarrassing, a little bit uncomfortable, but at the same time, I quite enjoyed attempting to educate, especially the foreign journalists and fans.
Now, speaking of education, what about the locals? Because obviously you come from a pretty progressive family. Did you feel this offered you an opportunity to set the record straight, educate those around you, especially the white folks?
Yeah, no, you know, my family, you know, growing up in Cape Town, I'd probably say they were progressive and fairly liberal, particularly when it came to race. You know, obviously people are not strictly conservative or liberal, or, you know, you have different views about different things. You know, I have conservative views in certain aspects of life. But it certainly did help trying to explain the situation, coming from a background where, as a young kid, I was assimilated with my fellow teammates who were colored and black and Indian, you know, of different cultures, different sizes, different shapes, you know. And that certainly helped, because the footballing industry here in South Africa has generally been very progressive all around the country, even way back in the dark days of apartheid. You know? 1969, you know, 1972 are years that stick out. There were attempts to bring non-racial professional football to South Africa. And even at my amateur club, Fishhoek, they opened their doors as early as the early 80s. And the local authorities made them pay for it as well. But a lot of clubs around South Africa, football clubs, took that stance.
Your father was a football administrator at some point?
Yeah, he was. He was a chairman for the early ages of 23, 24, and at varying stages of his give back. You know, he worked for the city of Cape Town for 40 years, and he gave a lot of his time to the club. And that sense of volunteerism has kind of left us. So I'm very proud of what he did for the club, and they've produced, that small catchment area has produced a lot of good footballers. You know, a handful of them have become professionals as well. So we've always been very proud of that catchment area and what the club has done, especially on a social level. You know, a lot of politicians don't understand what sport can do. We've seen it during the drought in Cape Town for 6 months. We've seen it during lockdown, the issues that do occur once you stop sport. Only 10% of school kids actually participate in sport around South Africa. It's not good enough.
Now, I suppose when he talks about putting your money where your mouth is, was when you married Sonia, a black woman. Tell us about how you guys met, and challenge, if any, with the interracial relationship, and then obviously the subsequent marriage?
Yeah, so, in 2000, shortly after the Olympics, when I arrived back, I was playing at Mamelodi Sundowns at the time, and one of my best mates was Alain Namogo, who was a Cameroonian footballer. He was playing with me at Sundowns, and he had a young daughter who needed a babysitter. So we made a trip to Cameroon for continental football club championships, and Sonia and her friend were looking after Alain's daughter. We arrived back, and he took me with to go and pick up the daughter, and that's where I met Sonia. So yeah, we started to socialize and go on sort of double dates, etc. And that's where it first started. Yeah.
What was the reaction from your peers, people around you, and society at large?
Yeah. I had no issues from my family or her family. I think it helped that Mamzala was a Sundowns fan. So that eased the passage.
Clearly picked the right team, didn't you?
So my mates, I state that I'm a progressive or liberal when it comes to race, and so are they. I don't think I would be friends with anybody that is conservative when it comes to race, So they also didn't have an issue. They were only happy for us, Culturally, there were some issues, although it helped that I kind of enjoy language. I enjoy learning about different culture, anthropology, people movement, etc., etc. So I love asking questions, and I think that's a great way for people to gain sympathy, or even better, empathy about somebody's circumstances and somebody's cultures when you do ask questions.
Yeah.
And so I learned, and I was fascinated by it, especially the cultural aspect, because Sonia comes from a very diverse background. Growing up in Soweto, her mum is Tswana, speaks Tswana. Her dad was Zulu. She went to a Pedi school.
Wow.
She can speak 5 languages. So that in itself was a very dynamic situation. Of course, now that we have 2 young boys, that brings a different dynamic to our family unit as well. So yeah, it was an interesting time initially, coming to terms with what she believed in, what she stood for, the role that I had to play, and the respect that comes with it. Not everything not everything you won't agree with everything, but you have to understand where she's coming from. That's most important.
Matthew, when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about raising your 2 boys with Sonia, and obviously the experience that you've had overseas. This is Cope. Stay with us. We're speaking to Matthew Booth, and we'll be right back. Thank you for staying with us. This is Cope, and in the hot seat today is Matthew Booth, a former Bafana Bafana legend. Matthew, before we took the break, we talked obviously about your marriage to Sonia. You have 2 boys, obviously mixed race. Tell us a little bit about raising your boys and some of the challenges that you've faced.
Well, I think initially when we had Nathan, I was playing in Russia. My wife, who was my girlfriend there then, was studying. She wrote her final exams with a big stomach, being pregnant, and so that was difficult for me because she was here in Johannesburg. I was in Russia, so that was probably the most testing time. You can imagine a pregnant partner, being away. And then as soon as she finished her studies, she did a BCom marketing degree. She came over to join me in Russia. So being a woman from Soweto, arriving in Russia, I was a bit concerned about how we were going to manage. But I feel that the whole racism issue in Russia is a bit overplayed. During my 6 years there with Sonia, living there, we didn't have one single ugly incident. It was mostly curiosity.
Yeah.
It probably helped the fact that we lived in two provincial towns as opposed to Moscow or St. Petersburg, two of the bigger metros. It also helped that perhaps I was pretty well known within the cities because I was playing football for the local team. But I find that you get pockets of racism and ignorance in nearly every country, and it's mostly from people who haven't really traveled. I find in my experience, who are cocooned in a particular environment or small town mentality, or influenced by certain groups, and very similar to what South Africans felt, how they felt pre-World Cup 2010, where the whole crime issue was ramped up by a foreign press. I think Russia also has similarly a bad reputation in that regard, which isn't really true.
Well, I like the fact that you've raised that issue. Obviously, Black Lives Matter, that movement is pretty current at the moment. Whose responsibility is it, though, to demystify the issues around race, to normalize for black people, brown people, yellow people, whatever color people, to associate and associate with indifference to color?
Well, look, I mean, I think it's also due to racism also due to the environment that you get brought up in. So if you can disassociate yourself with that environment and try to get out of your comfort zone, and ask questions and try and show not only sympathy but empathy, real empathy. I don't think enough people are doing that across the racial divide, across the race divide, from both sets. And if we can do that, I think that's the first step in the right direction. And once you've attempted to do that, then you can make your decision, an informed decision. And I don't think a lot of people are making public statements about race. I don't think a lot of them are coming from well-informed points of view or stances. So that's the first step. But it's a very complex issue. Let's face it. I mean, I went to Russia with a number of stereotypes in my head. Those were completely unfounded, when I arrived there.
Except the cold, I suppose.
Yeah, the cold and the vodka. And similarly to South Africa, I mean, imagine trying to explain to journalists who have just arrived on our doorstep our political situation or our racial situation, the history. And that's only my lived experience. Other people, thousands of other people, millions across the country have had different experiences. Different parts of our nation have had different journeys, different history completely. So how do you generalize?
Well, let's talk about raising your two boys with Sonia. She speaks 5 languages. One of your boys speaks Zulu. The other speaks Sotho, I think it is. You have English heritage. So quite a cultural mix right there, aside of your own separate identities as individuals. Has that proved to be a challenge? What are the conversations that you've had about how you will raise your boys?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm 33% Scandinavian, 20% Central European. I've got, British origin, 10% Ashkenazi Jew. I'm supposed to be Anglican. My mum was born in Malaysia, but she's English. Sonia grew up in Soweto. My mum is Tswana, dad is Zulu. Boys are obviously mixed raced.
Yeah.
You know, so, you know, how, how can you
Can't be easy,
generalize
right?
about, where do you start? So we, just like at school, where we try and offer our boys as many opportunities as possible to play sport and be educated and try different things, I think we also take that stance culturally. We expose them to a variety of different ways of living and doing things and traditions, and we've let them choose which ones they would like to adhere to, as long as they respect both of our ways, or both all the options that we give to them.
But I'd like to think that at some point they had no options, because they were obviously too young, and they would have had to have followed a certain regimen, if you were. What would that have been?
Or when they were young, they weren't. We didn't force anything upon them either. You know, there were issues which myself and my wife had to talk about quite thoroughly.
Yeah.
For example, circumcision when they were 2 or 3 days old. Slaughtering during traditional ceremonies. You know.
You've had that experience, haven't you? A number of times.
Yes, I have. Yeah, the first occasion I obviously needed to help, but the second or third occasion
What did you have to slaughter and why?
You know, when you buy a house, or simply when you feel you need to offer thanks, that's the time to pay homage. And so luckily there was a certain amount of understanding from her family side initially, but now I'm more experienced and I'm able to do it myself. And again, it's very much a respect issue. It's not something that I necessarily agree with or fully understand, but I go along with it.
So you clearly had to take one for the team.
Yeah, and it's, again, it was fascinating to me, you know. But going back to my boys, I mean, something as simple as not allowing my youngest to pet the goat or to make friends with the goat when we've brought it into the yard, you know.
For one purpose only.
Yeah, that's right. That initially was quite traumatizing for him. So it's all about being sensitive and understanding and respectful. And if you can find that balance, it really doesn't matter what culture or background you come from. Yeah.
I've observed that mixed race children may identify with predominantly the white culture or the black culture. Is it predetermined by how you raise the boys or raise your kids in any instance? Or do you think it's about them finding themselves? About them finding themselves.
We're always very strict about what type of friends they keep. And whenever we have them around at the house, it's not like an interrogation, but we can quickly sense who would be good for our boys and who wouldn't be. And very quickly they've been able to choose wisely. And I think we've done our job on that part. And the culture that they pick up, whether it's a mixture of different cultures or backgrounds, whatever you, traditions, is mostly dictated by the friends that they keep. We've attempted to give them as good guidance as possible, but you know, parenting is, you know, you do your best and then it's crossing your fingers, you know. And so far so good. Yeah.
Well, the world's become more global, rather it's become a global village. Greater access to different countries, different cultures, different races. Your advice to young people that are stepping out into the world, exploring interracial relationships, looking at marriage, what would those words be?
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously, you know, there's the first thing that when you're looking for a partner, the first thing is attraction, physical attraction. So everybody, I'm sure, has their preferences. But I'd just like to encourage young people not to be put off by getting out of their comfort zone, and even if it's not looking for a relationship in particular, again, getting back to the empathy part, getting to understand people, and not being turned off by the fact that somebody looks different to you, or has a different culture, comes from a different country, has a different skin color to you. Embrace their relationship, and discover and get out of your comfort zone. Just like a lot of our professional footballers here locally, they're in a comfort zone. They're earning good money, they're quite happy to stay here, but you're actually not improving as a person. You're not improving your skill set. And so I always encourage them to get over, play against better players, coached by better coaches. You become a better product. And likewise, in a relationship, you've sometimes got to get out of your comfort zone, and explore and expand your mind. Don't have blinkers on, and that's probably the best advice that I could give him.
And finally, your biggest challenge, do you think, the biggest hurdle you've had to cross, marrying outside of your culture or race?
I don't think I have had any. I've been rather fortunate, and perhaps, again, the fact that I've got a bit of a public profile, that kind of, I'm in a false situation, as opposed to somebody who doesn't. Perhaps would have more hurdles to jump. But I can't find one, or I can't think of one at the moment. I think probably, just adjusting to the cultural side of it, and being quite, not shocked, but more curious as to the reasoning behind such and such. I think that was a little bit difficult initially, but yeah, I can't think of anything major, to be honest. Yeah.
Well, I guess you're a lucky man. Matthew, thanks so much for coming on to Cope.
Always a pleasure, man.
It's been absolutely fabulous having Matthew Booth, former Bafana Bafana legend, on the show. We're back again next week. Remember, together we can. Goodbye.